Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, very excited to do this. I know that you've had an extensive leadership career over multiple companies. You were at Deloitte for a long time. Today, you're executive vice president, chief learning and insights officer at Mastercard. But before we get into a lot of the questions we have for you, one thing that I wanted to kick things off with was who has been the most memorable leader in your career thus far?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have to be careful how I answer this because I don't want to make mad any of my prior bosses. Um, there's one person, honestly, that has stuck out for me, and she's a woman that actually I worked with when I was at Deloitte, named Susan Burnett. And she came at a time when we were doing a lot of transformation work. And honestly, what stood out to her, or why I remember her so fondly, is because she was the first boss that I had that I felt like truly had my back, and would give me positive feedback, but would also give me feedback to help me get better. That might have been tough to hear. But the way that she did it, she really did it in the Kim Scott style of radical candor. And I always knew that she was giving me that feedback to make me better. And honestly, I feel like how she was able to have those conversations with me has really influenced how I even lead my own team today.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And so, talking about you leading your own team today, if we dial back and go back to when you first started leading teams, what were some of the mistakes that you tended to make back then?
Yeah, leading a team, it's kind of like an acquired taste, I think. I think you go into it, at least I did. I went into it thinking that because I had had all these other experience where I had been led, that I could do it better. And so went into it thinking that everyone was like I was and wanted what I wanted. So if there was any mistake, it was just assuming that there's one way to lead. I think what I found out was there's many different types of people. And honestly, at the point when I started leading teams, I didn't have children of my own. I wish I had, because I think you learn that just like you could have children that are very different and different personalities, that's what you have on a team. And sometimes it's not about giving everybody the same thing, but giving each individual what they need, and learning how to flex your style so that you can help people get the best out of themselves, and relate to them in a way that makes sense to them. And I think honestly, that becomes increasingly challenging if you have a distributed team that might be in different countries, from different cultures, different demographics, and just different life experiences, and really learning how to flex different muscles so that you can reach diverse team members that have different perspectives.
And so, I guess like the question I have for you is, how did you first realize that you weren't necessarily doing that, or leading people not in the way that they would have wanted, but maybe the way that you were used to when you were being led?
Um, Two actually key things for me that stand out. One was the first time that I received results from, we used to do engagement surveys for teams. And so as the leader, you would get a report out of how your team rated you and rated their experience overall in your team. And one of the first reports that I got was not very favorable. And again, you don't know who said what, right? You know, it's from your team, but you don't know who. But some of the verbatim comments that I had received on that, shared things like, your style is not everybody else's style. And I don't feel like you understood this perspective. And seeing some of those, honestly, it hurts when you read them because some of the comments are a little bit raw. But that was kind of my first glimpse that maybe I'm not exactly doing this the right way, or maybe there's another way to do this. I also had one very vocal team member, who I loved because she basically told me to my face and told me how it was and how she felt, and was very confident and open in doing that. And so kind of taking those two pieces, I kind of took a step back and said, maybe number one, I need to understand a little bit better, and actually go to people and get some feedback. And that's what really helped me come to this conclusion around, okay, there's actually people that learn differently, that want to develop differently, that want to have different types of conversations, and trying to figure out that diversity that I had on my team, and how to, like I said, just flex those different muscles, was helpful. And then having some of these tools, like if you do have access to any type of engagement survey or tool, that's a great way just to get the pulse on your team, as well as, reaching out to people and just saying, hey, how am I doing? I got this feedback. I'm wondering if you're feeling the same. And you really going out and proactively asking for it, rather than waiting for someone to feel confident, like that one person I did have on my team that felt confident to come and tell me directly.
Yeah, and I really like just the idea of taking whatever feedback or verbatim it is, and uh, and just being more curious and like asking more people, because I think you can. Sometimes it's hard to just read a sentence or two and
Yeah.
basically like learn a bunch of things. So there's always nuance to things, and so yeah, doing that kind of digging is I find super helpful too.
Yeah. And I'll tell you what else it does. I think doing that digging helps you build trust as a leader with your people. Because what it allowed me to do was say, hey, my intent was not to make you feel this way or make you feel like you had to do things my way. I understand that that's, the impact that it had on you. So that's helpful for me to understand. But that was not my intent. And I think even that, for the individual to hear that from me, was like, oh, okay. I thought, you were just doing things a certain way. They were probably making assumptions about me. I was making, certainly assumptions about them as well. And just having that open conversation led to a different level of trust that I think is just helpful, for teams to be high performing and be able to come together, in meaningful ways to create impact.
Yeah, no, I think that's really really good advice. Um, Sarah, one thing that we know about you is that, I mean, you are a future of work enthusiast and also a behavioral insights junkie. Um, I wanted to ask you, like, how did you first get interested in behavioral insights, and what basically has gotten you to be so passionate about it?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple of triggers. The first one was I spent the majority of my career in consulting. And one of the things that I realized being part of massive project teams, was that the projects that were more successful actually put more investment in the people side. So they invested in things like change management, they invested in communications and training. There were some project teams that did not make the same investments. And what I realized, having been part of both, was the teams that did, or the project teams that did make those investments, ended up with better results. And I thought, why is that? It kind of doesn't make sense. Like typically it's similar type people that are doing the work. The work itself is pretty similar, that we were doing across projects, yet we were having wildly different outcomes. So that kind of piqued my interest a bit. I had actually studied business at school, and it's really interesting because when you study kind of more traditional economics, it's all based on this theory of people being rational about their decisions. And as I started to dig into this behavioral science topic, what I found was it kind of turned a lot of that stuff that I had learned on its head to say, that's all fine and good if people were rational and made rational decisions, but they don't, because we're humans and we just don't do that. And so that kind of led just to a fascination with the topic, and just started doing a bunch of reading, and actually just listening to different stories of how this comes to life, was fascinating to me on why people behave in different ways. And I will tell you, when I had my own children, and was trying to figure out the whole parenting thing, which, when you're new to it, is a big hot mess and you don't know what you're doing. I realized that some of these things that I was reading and some of the different behavioral science techniques can't just be used in a business setting, but they're just good for any setting, personal settings, being a mother, being a spouse, being a daughter. And I started applying some of those same techniques, and I feel like it did make me a better mother. I felt it made me a better team leader at work. It made me a better partner. It made me a better friend.
I'd love to hear some examples, like, take parenting, like
Yeah.
what's an example that you can think of in this case?
Yeah. So one of my favorite examples, and this is as useful for a toddler as it is for a very experienced professional at any company that you may work for. So the example was, typically, if you want your child to do something, so say you're leaving the house and you want your child to put on their shoes. Typically what we say is, hurry up, we're going to be late. Or if you want to get your child to stop running because they're running into the street, you say, stop running. And so we're kind of telling them things that we don't want them to do, or we're putting kind of this anxiety, right? Like, hurry up, we're going to be late. So the behavioral science technique would be, instead of saying, for that example, hurry up, we're going to be late, you say, let's try to be really on time. Let's see how quickly we can put our shoes on so that we can be really on time. So you just change the frame from kind of that negative to a positive. Similarly, the running, if you want a child to stop running, the best way to do that is not to yell, stop running. It's to yell, can you walk slowly? So you tell them the behavior that you want to see, not the behavior that you don't want them to do. And that becomes their focus. And that, to me, you can apply to anything. Typically in a work setting, again, we tell people things we don't want them to do. Just change the frame. Tell them what you actually want them to do. Put the focus there. And then the same with the positive and negative. If there's something, again, for your population or your team, you want them to stop doing, tell them what you want them to start doing instead.
That's super interesting. For whatever reason, when it comes to kids, my brain wouldn't have gone there by default. When you said you put on your shoes and we're gonna be late, that I was like, yep, that's what you're supposed to say. Yeah. Right. So, but it's almost like I would have thought about it from a work perspective and said, well, that makes sense for work. Does it also make sense for kids? Very interesting. So why does that, like, what is it about, like, that reframing that makes that kind of, I guess, direction work better?
Well, I think that's what's most fascinating when you start studying behavioral science, because it actually all goes back to how our brains work. So it's all based in scientific evidence about how our brains work. And when we're saying things like, that hurry up or stop doing something that's building up that anxiety, it's triggering our brain in an unhelpful way. So even though the outcome that you want is just for the child to put their shoes on faster, or maybe for somebody on your team to complete their compliance training, but the way that you go about that by raising that anxiety level is actually having the opposite effect for the individual, because it's raising that anxiety and it's actually making it more difficult for them to perform the task that you're asking them to perform. When we frame things in a more positive realm, it triggers different parts of our brain. And those parts of our brain, when there's not kind of that, high anxiety, building that all up, it actually allows us to perform better and perform faster, which, if you think about it, typically, even in a work setting, that's always what we're trying to help our teams actually do.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. We've talked about this, and we've also talked about engagement surveys. I remember at a previous company, it is a larger company, and the CEO wanted everybody to do this engagement survey. And you know how these things are. For whatever reason, it takes a very long time to get everybody to do it. And then even at the end, a lot of times, not everyone still does it. And the typical strategy is the shaming, right? Like, and I mean, it's very interesting. What if the goal was, let's be one of the only companies that gets 100% completion, or that does it in record time? I mean, what a novel idea. It's
What a
very,
novel idea. Yeah, there's actually there's an awesome book called Nudge, if you haven't read it, and the behavioral science thing kind of tickles your fancy. I would definitely recommend it. Cass Sustain and Richard Thaler wrote the book, and there's great stories in there. And one of the stories they tell is about how they were able to get people to save electricity. And they tried a lot of different things. So they kind of tried the shaming thing, right? Like, oh my gosh, Eden, you're wasting so much energy, right? Trying to make people feel bad. They tried to play the financial play, like if you put your thermostat down 2 degrees, you can save this much money. And what they found actually worked was when they would send people's bill out, people would get their bill, and then they would get a smiley face, like a just kind of a like stoic face or a frown face. And what it said to them was, if you got the smiley face, you were in the top third of people that were saving energy. If you got kind of the stoic, you were in that middle. And if you were in the bottom, it was the bottom. And it was just like, this is what your other neighbors are doing. No judgment, right? It's not about saving money or we're shaming you. We're just showing you where you fall. And that's the one that actually got people to change behavior. The people that got the stoic one, or the people that got the frown, didn't want to be those people, because we all think we're better than average, right? So again, that kind of plays to just how the human brain works. And you can use some of those tricks to get people to behave in the ways that we're trying to influence.
wow, that is so smart. Yeah, that would be the first thing that I'd be competitive, call my neighbors and see, how did you rank? And I'd be upset if I wasn't higher. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so funny. I love that. And so I can definitely see how this stuff starts to impact the way that people manage their teams and also their company. And I was going to ask you about a book. So Nudge is a great resource. What do you think the impact of a lot of this is going to be on the future of work? Like, just knowing some of these concepts, like how do you imagine what the future of work will end up looking like?
Yeah, I think we're at a real inflection point. And I think in some ways, the silver lining of the pandemic has been that I think it's made us all realize that the future of work is human. It's getting the human piece right, right? How do you connect with people in a virtual environment? People you may never have met face to face, and you may not meet face to face as frequently as we did before the pandemic. How am I able to build that trust amongst my team when I'm only seeing them over a video or maybe on a phone call? And so I think fundamentally, before the pandemic, when we would talk about the future of work, a lot of the talk was about how technology was going to disrupt people's jobs and take their jobs away. And we should all be scared, and the robots were coming. And I think since the pandemic started, what we really realized the future of work is about is how can we tie in this human connection in a digital first world that we're all going to be working in going forward? How do you help leaders be more resilient in the face of unpredictable environments where each day brings new challenges that we've never had to deal with before? And especially for leaders, how they can managing themselves and what's going on with them individually, maybe with their family and their personal situation, and then also be able to show up to their team and be optimistic and set a vision. I think we put a lot of weight on the shoulders of leaders in this environment to lead in ways that we haven't necessarily prepared them for.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It's very interesting the way that you put it, because it wasn't as if the world, you're predicting that the world is going to go digital first. This is kind of like a thing that happened, but it's more like, how do you do that, but also keep the human element, which is super important. That's a very, very interesting way to frame that. And I would imagine, like, this is you have the most interesting title at Mastercard, which is
Thank
Chief
you.
Learning and Insights Officer. What is the objective of, like, what is your mission at the company?
Yeah, so it is. It's kind of my portfolio is probably pretty unique. And what we realized early on was, I mean, actually linking back to the future of work, but the future of work is really about learning and about skills, and how for our people, we can provide to them future employability, and make sure that they are ready for whatever the world throws at them. And I think, the past 18 months has been a great example of the importance of that, of how learning agility really matters. It's not just a nice thing to talk about and, say that it matters, but it matters because we're put in these situations. And, hopefully there won't be another global pandemic anytime in my lifetime, but there's going to be other situations that come up that we're going to need people to quickly react to, and be able to pivot. And I know when the pandemic first happened, even at Mastercard, we had to shift priorities very quickly. And we needed to have the flexibility to be able to do that. And so I think this, the focus on learning, very important. On the insight side, what we realized was, in order for us to really know what we needed to do, and understand what skills are important, it needs to be backed in data and insights. And so in the past, a lot of learning has been around, let's educate people on these different things that we believe are important, right? Product knowledge, different types of technical knowledge, that is evolving in the landscape. And we put a lot of time and energy and focus there. What we've been able to do now, and a lot of this is through some of the data and insights work that we do on my team, is realize how much some of these other areas, some of the more enduring human capabilities, are critically important. And that only together with those does the things like product knowledge or technical expertise really come together to produce anything meaningful. And so for us at Mastercard, putting learning and insights together was to say, we're going to take a data-driven approach, to make sure that, just like we do with any of our customers, we're coming in with data first, the evidence first, and that we really believe that the currency for the future for our workforce is all about skills. And we're going to make sure that where we decide to invest and how we decide to allocate our time is all rooted in that, versus maybe just how we've done things in the past because we've always done things that way.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And the point about like not doing things always the same way, I think is very apt, especially like for everything that we've seen in the last 18 months, or has it been 2 years now? It's kind of all blended in. One thing that I wanted to ask you about, which is also kind of ties into learning, is that you have a reverse mentorship, I guess, relationship with the chief talent officer at Mastercard. What is reverse mentorship?
Yeah, so reverse mentorship, probably the last 5 or so years, maybe even 10 years, to be honest, at this point, because you're right, the COVID blur, I don't even know how many years it's been, has started to be something that I think a number of organizations have focused on, which is typically when people think of mentoring, they think of somebody more senior, providing perspective, insights, advice to somebody more junior. I think that's been the more traditional definition. Reverse mentoring is meant to acknowledge that we can all learn from each other. And I will tell you, I think every day I learn more from my kids than they probably do for me. And so reverse mentoring is about not just thinking you have to look up to someone that's in a more senior role, who is older than you, or that has more experience, but that we can all be learning from each other. And a great example, some of the stuff that we do at Mastercard is pairing actually some of our more experienced executives with more junior career level employees, to help them get more comfortable with maybe emerging technologies, with social media that might not have been second nature to them. So the reverse mentoring relationship I have with Kelly was just that. It was us kind of coming together and recognizing that, wow, I knew I had a lot to learn from her, and really wanted to understand her experiences and get her thoughts on things I was going through. But the most fascinating thing was she was basically like, well, I'm not going to just be your mentor, you're going to be my mentor too. And so it was that two-way dialogue where we could have a conversation, each learn from each other, And it really turned into a wonderful avenue for me to have, number one, somebody to go to help me when I needed perspective, but also made me feel really valued that, even where I was at the stage of my career where I am, that I actually have something to offer to folks that are at a different point in their career as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'd love to know, like, tactically speaking, you say that sometimes you pair more senior execs with more junior folks, especially to, I guess, keep them in the loop on latest technology trends, or are those like, how does that work? I guess, like, tactically speaking, is it that they start to meet on a regular cadence, or what is the
Yeah.
playbook there?
So the one thing I've learned, having done a number of mentoring programs, is it needs a little bit of structure, but not too much structure. So the biggest thing that I think any organization tactically can do is to help with the matching piece, to make sure that you're doing the best to match people whose needs make sense. And then after that, really leaving it up to the individuals. So we also have a women's mentoring program at Mastercard, where we match different women together, again, to share a perspective. And all that Mastercard does is help you kind of make that match with somebody else in the organization. And then the two of you get together and you decide, do we want to meet every month? Do we want to meet every other month? Maybe we want to meet on an as needed basis. And actually having that conversation and being able as a pair to set up what your standards are going to be, we found actually works much better than to put too many guardrails to say, you have to meet every month and here's what you have to talk about and you have to report it this way. But to let it be a little bit more organic, where we're going to help you make that connection. And again, we'll give you some, guidance. We'll share some things that have worked for other people, but then it's really up to you to do with it what you want.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and good tactical advice there. And what do you think? What are some things that like? Do you think that this also helps with building a more inclusive culture? You mentioned, like, specifically around a women mentoring program. Would love for you to elaborate on that.
I mean, I think it definitely does. I think it's very, we talked a little bit about just doing things a certain way because you've always done it. That has a name. It's called inertia, and it's a really challenging thing to overcome. And I think what some of these things, like a mentoring program, help to do is get you out of maybe some of those habits that may not be intentional, to be honest, right? I may go to the same people for advice or perspective because that's what I've always done. And it's just easy to do, and I know how to do it. I think pushing people and making connections with somebody that I probably wouldn't have had the opportunity to come across because they sit in a different office, they're in a different group, they're at a different point in their career, allows you, it almost forces you in a way to make a connection with another individual. And then it allows you to share your story so you get a different perspective. My mentee that I was matched with for the women's mentoring program was a woman who was out of our Santiago, Chile office. And this was during COVID. And it was so fascinating for me to learn about, number one, how the pandemic was impacting a different country, what they were trying to do in that country, what some of our policies were, what some of the commonalities were between what I was going through in the United States, in New York. And I remember at the beginning, New York City was really the epicenter of what was happening in the United States. And so early on, she would be like, oh, I'm watching, this on the news, and we would talk about that. And then as the pandemic progressed, South America got really bad. And she shared some stories about what was happening in Chile. And she's actually from Colombia, and she was trying to get back to Colombia to see her family. But the flights were restricted because obviously they were trying to be careful about the flow of people and spreading the virus. And it was just, I never would have gotten that perspective had I just had to do that on my own. So I think it does help when you think about it from a inclusion and diversity perspective, to just give different avenues and different pathways for people to make these connections. Because again, it's not that I didn't want to make the connection with this woman. It just would have been much harder for me to seek her out.
Yeah, no, I see that that can make a huge difference, and certainly like a big reason why people should put into place these sorts of programs that just make these connections that otherwise wouldn't be possible. One thing that I did want to talk to you about was just characteristics of great leaders. So, in a roundtable discussion, you had said that you look for leaders that are resilient, create some level of clarity for their teams around expectations and prioritization, and leaders who instill a sense of followership. I'd love for you to maybe elaborate on that and how managers can create clarity around expectations and prioritizations.
Yeah, so I think that word clarity here is key. I think in this dynamic environment that we all live in and will continue, that clarity is really important. So I think in the past, what people really wanted was some sort of certainty. And what we all know now as leaders is we can't give people that because, who could have predicted this pandemic? I mean, I remember when we went seemingly overnight from having everyone in the office to having everybody at home. Nobody saw that coming. And even early on, we thought it was going to be short-lived. I wouldn't have thought I'd be sitting here, over a year and a half later, and still have most of our workforce working from home. It didn't seem possible. But I think what leaders can provide, because we don't know with certainty what will happen, what will change, is you can be very clear with your team on what we're trying to achieve. What are those outcomes that we need to achieve? And I think that clarity around those outcomes allows you to be more flexible in how you get them done. So when something happens where all of a sudden everybody was home, we have more flexibility on how we actually achieve what we need to achieve, but at least we're all aligned on what it is that we're trying to achieve, right? We all have the same goals in mind. We all have one vision. I think that's critically important. I think the other thing that helps with clarity is conversation. So especially in a virtual world, conversation is really important. So where you might not have, you're just going to run into somebody in the office. You're not going to maybe have some of that idle chit chat before you go into a meeting. Make sure that you're baking that time in when you're in any type of virtual or distributed setting. So whether that's virtual coffee chats, whether that's just picking up the phone and calling someone and just checking in and say, hey, how are you? And another good tip I learned in a virtual world is when you do that and you say, hey, Aiden, how are you? Again, this is behavioral science. You're typically going to be like, I'm fine, Sarah, I'm fine. And the tip I have is always ask again. And I would say, are you really fine, Aiden? And then you might say, well, actually, my kid was up last night. Or actually my fridge just broke and that kind of opens up the conversation. So I think, yes, clarity around, what it is that the team is trying to achieve, but then just as important to get to that clarity, to let people ask questions and just check in on people is conversation.
Is there an example of when, like, you noticed maybe something that you had done that was more clear like the second time around, or maybe like something that wasn't clear the first time around, and what happened, and then like how clarity made it better?
Yeah, I actually think this happens a lot when you might be in a meeting with someone. So I'll give you one of my examples, but I'll be in a meeting with one of my team members. So we're in the same meeting, and we go in maybe with a deck or some kind of document that we're going to talk about, and we're getting feedback from somebody. And so I'm taking my notes. We're all in the conversation. The person on my team is also taking some of those notes. And coming out of that, I'll look at that person and be like, okay, I think we're good. We know, you're going to take that. I'm going to take this. What I found is if you probe a little bit more, and instead of doing that, actually sit down and say, hey, so how do you think that went? What did you hear? What did you take away? You'll actually find that there might not be that much consistency. And so instead of just kind of going and updating whatever you're going to update, kind of taking your things, to which you might come back and I would look at, the deck or the document and say, well, wait, that's not what I took away. I took away the feedback was this. That can really lead to a lot of extra work and a lot of back and forth. So I think, again, taking the time up front, not to assume that just because I heard feedback a certain way or I wrote down a certain note, that that's exactly what it is, but compare that with other people that are hearing the same thing, because we all are interpreting through our own lens and our own experiences. And sometimes even two people that are part of the same meeting having the same conversation are not aligned on what those key takeaways are.
Yeah, no, that's a really good example. I like that, and super tactical is something that we can all start doing. I wanted to also ask you about diverse teams. I know that you have this model at Mastercard. Do I have it correct that it's the 2+2+2+5 model? Is that what the model is called?
So this is our kind of development. So getting at diversity of experience, education, and how you think about your own career. And the overall intent, because I think any company can call it any cute little formula or moniker, but the intent is to not just think about yourself or not just be defined by the job that you're doing today or even the role that you got hired into, but think about where you can play across a range of areas. And when you think about that range, you should be thinking about different things. You should be thinking about, at Mastercard, for example, we have different business units. We have different regions. We have different functions. We have different learning academies that help shape different content for our people. So the intent of that model is to say, in order for you to grow and develop in your career, you shouldn't just be focused on one area, but you should be focused on a number of areas, because that allows you to be a bit more well-rounded to really understand the business. And actually, even if you're a specialist, right? And I code, and that's what I do, and that's what I was hired to do, and that's what I want to do. By understanding those other areas, you'll be a better coder because you'll understand how it works in our context and what some of the opportunities are to perhaps apply your skill set in many different situations.
Yeah, I think, this is a very interesting thing coming from like a startup life where, I've always been one of the first few employees, and then, obviously kind of growing, you end up building a lot of context that becomes much harder. I can only imagine at like the Mastercard level, the amount of context that exists. What do you do to kind of encourage this context building? Like, how do people, I mean, it's such a big company. How would you even go about allowing them to do that?
Yeah, we did we actually had a big campaign this year. We did, because of COVID, actually, we did our first ever virtual learning conference we called Skill Up. And actually our a major focus of it was this concept of range. And David Epstein, you want another book? Aiden, I'll give you another book. But David Epstein wrote a fantastic book called Range. And it was basically about how a lot of us, in our heads, we think about you have to have the 10,000 hours and you need to specialize in something. And the Tiger Woods example of how he started playing golf when he was 2 years old. And that's why he became such an amazing golf player. And what David Epstein starts to tease out in his book is those are actually more the exceptions, and that type of model works really well for the type of work that is very predictable. There's patterns that you can learn from, and that really just doesn't change. But if you think about the world that we live in, most of our jobs are not really like that. So for the rest of us, what actually seems to be more useful is this concept of range, where by having a diversity of experience, even a diversity of education, a diversity of jobs, a diversity of relationships and networks, actually makes you better at being able to solve complex problems and think differently about your own work and how that can apply in different situations. So we've been making a big push there. Again, number one, just around education, around this concept, what it is. And then what that affords people as far as flexibility and where they can take their career. So just because you join Mastercard on a sales team and you're with one account, maybe you want to get on the product side, or maybe you want to pivot into a more technical role. And that's actually okay. And we actually encourage it because we think you're going to be a better technical person if you've had some sales experience. And we think you're going to be a better salesperson if you've had some product experience.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly valuable, and I 100% agree. Range was such a great book. I also would second the recommendation. Um, this has been, Sarah. This has been really great. So many different insights. We've talked about so many useful and tactical tips and examples throughout the conversation. One question that we like to ask all of our guests is, for all the managers and leaders out there constantly looking to get better at their craft, what final tips, tricks, or words of wisdom would you leave them with?
So I think, the number one thing is continue to stay curious, and ask questions and probe in different areas, because we know that, learning doesn't stop, and there's always opportunities for us to change our perspective. And I think when we get stuck is when we think we've reached, it's kind of that fixed mindset. You think you know what there is to know. And then that's all the tools that you're using in your tool belt versus trying to go out and seek out new and different information. And just to bring it back to kids one last time, I think kids here are excellent at that. If you think about the questions that little kids ask, and if you're not around little kids, go spend some time around them because it's super fascinating to see how their brains work. I'll give you one quick example. My son, a couple years ago, he's 8 years old now. I think when he was 5 or 6, the alarm in our house was going off, and and we were kind of scrambling around. I'm like, why is the alarm going off? And my son was sitting there, and then we fixed it. And then afterwards, he said, "Mom, why did you say the alarm was going off?" And I'm like, "What do you mean the alarm was going off?" He's like, "It wasn't going off; it was going on." And I was like, "Oh, you're right. It was going on. Why do we say that?" Like I never, and again, just that perspective to say, yeah, let me think about that. I'm not sure why we say that. Let's dig into that a little bit better and really understand why we do the things we do. And again, try to fight some of this inertia, and think about how we can do things in new and different ways.
Well, Sarah, this has been great, and thank you so much for doing this.
Absolutely. I was happy to be here.